The world seemed to fall apart when I was just 15. One day, I had a family, a roof over my head, and a warm meal waiting for me at home. The next, I was standing in a cold, lifeless hospital room, staring at my parents' bodies, trying to comprehend that they were gone. My mom, with her warm hugs and endless encouragement. My dad, with his stern but loving guidance. A car accident had taken them both in an instant, leaving me alone in a world that felt bigger and colder than ever before. We didn't have much to begin with, so there was no inheritance, no cushion to fall back on. The landlord gave me 2 weeks to clear out of the small apartment we called home. And just like that, I was homeless. I had no extended family to turn to. They were either gone or unwilling to take on the responsibility of a teenager. The first few months were the hardest. I slept in shelters when there was space, or under bridges and in abandoned buildings when there wasn't. Hunger became a constant companion, gnawing at me like a dull ache I couldn't shake. I scrounged for food wherever I could, picking up scraps at the back of restaurants or digging through dumpsters. But even in those darkest moments, I refused to give up. I couldn't explain it. Maybe it was my mom's voice in the back of my mind, urging me to keep going, or my dad's stern lessons about resilience. Whatever it was, it kept me moving. I started looking for work anywhere that would take me. At 15, with no experience and no connections, my options were limited. Most people didn't want to hire a homeless teenager. I knocked on doors, begged for odd jobs, and eventually found my way to a rundown car wash on the edge of town. The owner, a gruff man named Pete, looked me up and down with a skeptical expression when I asked him for work. "You ever washed a car before, kid?" he asked, wiping his hands on a dirty rag. "No," I admitted, "but I can learn. I'll do whatever it takes." Pete scratched his chin, then let out a sigh. "All right, I'll give you a week, but if you screw up, you're out." That first week was brutal. The hours were long. The pay was barely enough to cover a meal, and my hands were raw and blistered from scrubbing dirt and grime off countless cars. But I worked as hard as I could, determined to prove myself. Pete didn't say much, but I noticed the way he watched me out of the corner of his eye, as if he was waiting for me to quit. When I showed up every morning, rain or shine, he started to nod at me in a way that almost felt like approval. By the end of the month, I was a full-time employee. The money wasn't much, but it was enough to keep me fed and occasionally rent a cheap motel room for the night. I began to save what little I could, tucking crumpled bills into an old coffee can I kept hidden under the bench in the staff room. Over the next few years, the car wash became my life. I learned every trick in the book: how to get stubborn grease stains off tires, how to buff scratches out of paint, and how to make even the oldest, dirtiest cars shine like new. Pete started trusting me with more responsibility, letting me manage shifts and even handle the cash register on busy days. But it wasn't enough. Deep down, I knew I didn't want to spend the rest of my life scrubbing cars. Not that there was anything wrong with it. Pete was a good man who'd built his business from the ground up, but I wanted more. I didn't know what more looked like yet, but I knew I had to find it. One rainy afternoon, when I was 19, everything changed. It had been a slow day at the car wash, and I was just finishing up cleaning the interior of an expensive black SUV. The owner had left it with us earlier, saying he'd be back in a couple of hours. As I reached under the driver's seat to vacuum, my hand brushed against something hard. Curious, I pulled it out and found myself holding a small suitcase. It was heavy, the kind of weight that made my heart race. My first thought was to ignore it, to put it back and pretend I hadn't seen it. But something about the way it was wedged under the seat made me hesitate. I set the suitcase on the passenger seat and stared at it for a moment, debating what to do. It wasn't mine, and I knew better than to mess with other people's belongings. But the curiosity was overwhelming. Finally, I gave in. I unzipped the suitcase just enough to peek inside, and what I saw made my breath catch. Stacks of cash. Neatly bundled bills. More money than I'd ever seen in my life. My hands shook as I zipped the suitcase back up, my mind racing. I knew I had to tell Pete. This wasn't something I could handle on my own. When the SUV's owner came back later that afternoon, I watched from the corner of the lot as Pete handed over the keys and the man drove away. I couldn't bring myself to say anything. Part of me was afraid of what the man would do if he found out I'd seen the suitcase, afraid of what Pete would think if he knew I'd been tempted to open it. But the image of those stacks of cash stayed with me. That kind of money could change everything. It could pull me out of the cycle I'd been stuck in for years, give me a chance to build a life for myself. And that's when the plans started to form. For the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about the suitcase. It became an obsession, taking up space in my mind no matter how much I tried to focus on work. The stacks of cash I'd seen were unlike anything I could comprehend. I'd never even held more than a few $100s at once. And here was what had to be tens of thousands, or maybe even more. But it wasn't just about the money. There was something else, something that gnawed at me. Who was the man who had left it behind? Why would he carry that kind of cash in his car? And why would he leave it unattended? I kept replaying the details in my head. His suit was expensive, but it looked worn, his face tired and lined. He wasn't flashy like some of the other wealthy customers who came through the car wash. And the way he spoke, hurried, distracted, gave me the impression that he was carrying more than just physical weight. A week after he had left the SUV, something happened that shattered my indecision. I was working the early shift when Pete came up to me, his face serious. "You remember that guy with the black SUV from last week?" he asked. I nodded, trying to keep my expression neutral. "Yeah, what about him?" Pete sighed, running a hand over his face. "He's dead. Saw it in the paper this morning. Heart attack, apparently. Poor guy wasn't even that old." My stomach dropped. "Didn't leave anyone behind, either," Pete continued. "No family, no nothing. It's a damn shame." I nodded again, but I wasn't really listening. My mind was spinning, racing through the implications of what Pete had just said. If the man was dead, that meant the suitcase was still unclaimed. The temptation that I'd been trying so hard to resist came rushing back, stronger than ever. After my shift, I made a decision. The man had left an address on his order form when he dropped off the SUV, and I had memorized it without meaning to. I told myself I would go there, not because I wanted to take the suitcase, but because I wanted answers. Maybe he had family or friends who needed to know about it. Maybe it wasn't even as much money as I thought, and I was blowing things out of proportion. But when I pulled up to the address later that night, it became clear that no one was coming back for that suitcase. The house was dark, the windows boarded up. A foreclosure notice was taped to the front door, flapping in the wind. The yard was overgrown with weeds, and the mailbox was overflowing with unopened letters. I stood there for a long time, staring at the house and trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It didn't match the image I'd built in my mind of the man who had left the SUV. How could someone with that kind of money live in a place like this? I went back to the car wash the next day, my thoughts tangled in knots. I told myself I would forget about the suitcase, that I would let it go and move on with my life. But when I opened the staff locker I'd stashed it in, hidden under old towels, untouched since the man's death, I knew I couldn't. The suitcase was right there, waiting for me like some kind of forbidden treasure. It felt heavier than I remembered when I lifted it out, my heart pounding in my chest. I opened it again, this time fully unzipping it. It wasn't just cash inside. There were documents, folders filled with papers I couldn't make sense of at first glance. Contracts, spreadsheets, letters. But what caught my attention were the business licenses. The man had owned several small businesses around the city. Car washes, laundromats, convenience stores. My first thought was to hand it all over to the authorities. It wasn't mine, and I had no right to it. But then I remembered Pete's words. The man had no family, no one to inherit any of it. These businesses would sit abandoned, and the money would be seized or lost in bureaucratic red tape. I told myself that I wasn't stealing. I was salvaging. For the next month, I worked tirelessly. During the day, I kept my job at Pete's car wash, scrubbing tires and vacuuming carpets like nothing had changed. But at night, I pored over the documents in the suitcase, trying to piece together the man's business empire. I discovered that several of the businesses were struggling. They were barely breaking even, weighed down by poor management and neglected upkeep. But there was potential there, potential I couldn't ignore. I used some of the cash from the suitcase to visit the businesses, posing as an investor interested in buying them out. Most of the managers were eager to sell, desperate to get out of their failing situations. Within 3 months, I'd taken ownership of 3 businesses, a small laundromat, a car wash, and a rundown convenience store. Owning the businesses was only the beginning. I spent every waking hour working to turn them around. I hired staff who cared about the work, reinvested profits into renovations, and focused on customer service. The car wash was the first to take off, its reputation quickly spreading as the best in the area. The laundromat was next, bringing in steady income after I upgraded the machines and lowered the prices. The convenience store took the longest, but after stocking it with better products and marketing it as a community staple, it finally started turning a profit. I hardly slept during those first few years. Every dollar I earned went straight back into the businesses, and I lived as frugally as possible. I still rented a small apartment and drove an old, beat-up car, but I didn't care. Every late night, every early morning, every moment of doubt and exhaustion was worth it. Because slowly but surely, my hard work started to pay off. By the time I turned 23, I was no longer the desperate kid scrubbing cars for spare change. My 3 businesses were thriving, bringing in more income than I ever thought possible. I didn't feel rich, not yet. I still lived in the same tiny apartment, still wore the same scuffed shoes, and still worked like everything could fall apart at any moment. But I had something I'd never had before: stability. The laundromat ran like a well-oiled machine, the car wash was packed on weekends, and the convenience store had become a neighborhood staple. I'd hired managers for each location, people I trusted to keep things running while I worked behind the scenes. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. Still, I hadn't told anyone where it all started. Not Pete, not the employees I hired, not even the friends I'd made since leaving the streets. The suitcase was my secret, a part of my life I wasn't ready to share. One rainy evening, I found myself sitting in the office of the car wash I'd purchased, going over receipts. The day had been slow, and most of the employees had already left. The building was quiet except for the sound of rain tapping against the windows. As I leaned back in my chair, staring at the numbers on the page, I thought about how far I'd come. And yet, there was a strange emptiness I couldn't shake. I had money now, more than I'd ever dreamed of, but I didn't feel like I belonged in this new world. I wasn't living extravagantly. I didn't have a fancy car or designer clothes. My life was still simple, and I liked it that way, but something was missing. A few weeks later, while visiting one of the car wash locations, I met someone who would change everything. Her name was Claire. She'd come in driving a beat-up old sedan, the kind that had seen better days, and I could tell she wasn't there for a luxury service. She looked about my age, maybe a little younger, with dark hair pulled back into a loose ponytail and tired eyes that still held a spark of determination. I was walking through the lot when she approached me, holding her keys nervously. "Excuse me," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I was wondering if there's any way you could, skip the interior cleaning? I just need the outside washed, and I'm on a bit of a budget." I paused, taken aback by her honesty. Most customers just paid the full price without a second thought, but there was something refreshingly straightforward about the way she spoke. "We can work something out," I said, waving her over to the counter. I ended up waiving the fee entirely, telling her it was on the house. She protested at first, insisting she could pay, but eventually, she accepted with a grateful smile. "It's just a car wash," I said, brushing it off. "No big deal." She smiled again, wider this time. "It is to me." Over the next few months, Claire became a regular customer. She worked 2 jobs, juggling shifts at a diner and a community center, and every now and then, she'd come by to get her car washed when she could afford it. We started talking more, our conversation stretching from a few minutes to half an hour. She told me about her life, how she'd grown up in a rough neighborhood and was trying to save enough money to go back to school. I told her bits and pieces of my story, though I left out the part about the suitcase and how I'd come to own the business. There was something about her that reminded me of myself. Her drive, her resilience, her refusal to give up no matter how hard things got. It was like looking into a mirror of my past. One evening, as we sat outside the car wash after closing, sharing a greasy bag of takeout, Claire asked me a question I wasn't prepared for. "Why do you work so hard?" she said, tilting her head curiously. I hesitated, unsure how much to tell her. "Because I had to," I said finally. "When I was younger, I didn't have anyone to rely on. It was either work hard or nothing." She nodded, her expression thoughtful. That makes sense. But now that you've made it, do you ever think about slowing down? Made it? I repeated, laughing. I'm not sure I've made it yet. She raised an eyebrow. You own this place, don't you? Yeah, I admitted. Then you've made it, she said firmly. Most people dream of having something like this. Don't sell yourself short. Her words stuck with me long after she left that night. I'd spent so long focused on survival and success that I hadn't stopped to think about what came next. Claire and I grew closer over time. She became a part of my life in a way I hadn't expected, her presence grounding me and reminding me of the things that really mattered. It wasn't just about money or success anymore. It was about building something meaningful, not just for myself, but for the people around me. With Claire's encouragement, I started thinking bigger. I began looking into ways to expand my businesses, not just to make more money, but to create jobs and give back to the community. And for the first time, I felt like I wasn't just chasing survival. I was building a life. 4. Claire's presence in my life brought a clarity I hadn't realized I was missing. For so many years, I had been running on pure determination, one foot in front of the other, grinding through life as if I was constantly one misstep away from losing everything. But for the first time, she made me stop and ask myself, why am I doing all this? Owning businesses had given me stability, something I never thought I'd have. But I'd never stopped to think about what I wanted beyond survival. Claire's simple, pointed questions, what's next? Why not think bigger? Forced me to reevaluate what I was working toward. I started small. One day, I sat down and reviewed every part of my businesses with a sharper eye. The car washes were doing well, but I saw opportunities to make them better. I upgraded the equipment to make the process more efficient, invested in advertising, and even introduced an eco-friendly option that brought in a whole new crowd of customers. The laundromat got a facelift too. I repainted the walls, replaced the flickering lights, and added a kids' play area to make it a more welcoming place for families. The convenience store was the hardest project, but with Claire's help, I turned it into something that actually served the community, focusing on affordable groceries, fresh produce, and hosting small events like book drives and food donations. Claire became more than just a sounding board. She became my partner. She had this way of seeing the bigger picture, of helping me connect the dots when I was too caught up in the details. I hadn't planned on falling for her, but it happened so naturally that I didn't realize how much she meant to me until one night when we were sitting in my tiny apartment, eating takeout. You should hire someone to do this stuff for you, she said, waving her chopsticks toward the stack of paperwork on the coffee table. I laughed. What? And miss out on all this fun? She rolled her eyes. I'm serious. You've done so much already. It's time to delegate. Let someone else handle the day-to-day stuff so you can focus on growing. I shrugged, but her words lingered in my mind. You're building something amazing, Elliot, she said softly. But you can't do it all alone. Her words hit me harder than I expected. I wasn't used to hearing that kind of encouragement, especially not from someone who truly believed in me. Thanks, Claire, I said quietly. For what? For sticking around, I said, meeting her gaze. For believing in me. She smiled, and that was the moment I realized just how much she'd become a part of my life. The changes Claire suggested weren't easy. Letting go of control was hard, especially when I'd spent so many years fighting for every scrap of success. But she was right, I couldn't do it all on my own. I hired managers to take over more responsibilities at each business, freeing me up to focus on new opportunities. It was a gamble, but it paid off. With more time to plan and strategize, I was able to expand. The second laundromat opened 6 months later, followed by another convenience store on the other side of town. I partnered with local charities to host events and give back to the community that had supported me. People started recognizing my name, not just as the guy who owned a few businesses, but as someone who cared about the city and its people. One day, as I was wrapping up a meeting with a supplier, I got a call from Pete. Hey kid, he said, his gruff voice instantly familiar. Pete, it's been a while, I said, leaning back in my chair. Yeah, well, I've been busy keeping this old place running, he said. But I saw your name in the paper the other day. Big shot business owner now, huh? I laughed. Something like that. You're doing good, Elliot, he said, his tone softer than I'd ever heard it. Proud of you. Those words hit me harder than I expected. Pete had been the closest thing to a mentor I'd ever had, and hearing him say he was proud felt like closing a chapter one didn't even realize was open. "Thanks, Pete," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "That means a lot." As time went on, things kept growing. By the time I turned 25, I was running 6 businesses, employing dozens of people, and making more money than I ever thought possible. But the money wasn't what mattered most. What mattered was the life I was building, the people I was helping, the community I was becoming a part of, and the love I had found in Claire. She had become my partner in every sense of the word. We worked together, dreamed together, and built something I could never have imagined on my own. One night, as we sat on the balcony of our first shared apartment, watching the city lights flicker in the distance, Claire turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "What's next for you?" she asked. I smiled. "Isn't this enough?" She shook her head, laughing softly. "You know what I mean? You've come so far, but I don't think you're done yet." "What's your big dream, Elliot?" I thought about it for a moment. For so long, my dream had simply been survival, scraping by, making enough to eat, keeping a roof over my head. Then it had been success, building a life out of nothing. But now, with Claire by my side and a world of possibilities in front of me, I realized my dream had changed again. "I want to create something that lasts," I said finally. "Something bigger than me. I want to give people the chances I didn't have. I want to make a difference." Claire smiled, reaching for my hand. "Then let's do it," she said. And for the first time, I felt like I wasn't just surviving, I was living. By the time I hit 30, the life I'd built was unrecognizable from the one I'd come from. What had started with a few car washes and a handful of desperate ideas had grown into a thriving business empire. I owned multiple car washes, laundromats, convenience stores, and even a small chain of coffee shops that Claire and I had launched together. But it wasn't just the success that defined this phase of my life. It was the purpose. After years of clawing my way out of nothing, I realized I didn't want my story to end with me. I wanted to build something that could help others, something that could make the world just a little easier for people who were stuck in the same place I'd once been. It was Claire who reminded me of that over and over again. Her constant presence in my life, her ability to see beyond numbers and profits, pushed me to think bigger. She wasn't just my partner in business. She was my partner in life, the person who had believed in me when I still wasn't sure I believed in myself. The idea for the youth center came on a quiet night at home. We were sitting in the living room of our modest house, a stack of paperwork spread out on the coffee table. I was going over plans for another expansion, a new laundromat in a nearby city, but my focus kept drifting. "What's on your mind?" Claire asked, setting down her cup of tea. I hesitated, running a hand through my hair. "I've been thinking, we've done a lot, haven't we? The businesses, the donations, the programs. But it feels like there's still more to do." She smiled. "There's always more to do. What are you thinking about?" I leaned back, staring at the ceiling. "Something bigger. Something permanent. I want to create a space for kids like me. Kids who don't have anywhere to go, who don't have anyone to show them they can do more." Claire tilted her head, intrigued. "A youth center?" "Yeah," I said, the idea solidifying in my mind. "But not just a place to hang out. A place where they can learn skills, find mentors, and figure out their path. Somewhere that gives them real opportunities." She reached for my hand, her smile growing. "Then let's make it happen." We spent the next year planning and building. The youth center was located in the same neighborhood where Pete's Car Wash had given me my first job. It felt fitting to give back to the place where everything had started. The building itself was modest but functional, with classrooms, a workshop space, and a small lounge for kids to relax. We partnered with local businesses and charities to offer classes on everything from carpentry and cooking to resume writing and interview prep. It wasn't just about keeping kids off the streets. It was about giving them tools to build a future. The grand opening was one of the proudest moments of my life. As I stood on the small stage, looking out at the crowd of supporters, employees, and community members, I felt a wave of gratitude that was hard to put into words. I wouldn't be standing here today without the help of so many people. I began, my voice steady despite the lump in my throat. When I was younger, I didn't think I'd make it this far. But I was lucky. I had people who gave me chances, who believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself. I paused, glancing toward Pete, who was standing in the front row with a proud smile on his face. This center isn't just about giving back, I continued. It's about creating opportunities for others to succeed, just like I was given. Because no one should have to face the world alone. The applause that followed was overwhelming, but what meant the most was seeing the faces in the crowd. Kids who would use the center, parents who saw hope for their families, and people like Pete and Claire, who had believed in me from the start. The youth center became the heart of everything I did. It wasn't just a project or a way to give back. It was a legacy, something that would outlive me. The kids who came through the doors reminded me of myself at their age, scared, lost, and desperate for a way out. Seeing them learn, grow, and gain confidence was more rewarding than any paycheck or business deal. One afternoon, as I was helping a group of teenagers with a woodworking project, a boy named Marcus came up to me. He was shy, barely 15, and had been coming to the center for a few weeks. "Mr. Elliott," he said, his voice hesitant. "Yeah, Marcus?" He fidgeted with the hem of his shirt. I wanted to say thanks. For this place, it's helped me a lot." I smiled, clapping him gently on the shoulder. "You're the one doing the hard work, Marcus. But I'm glad we could help." He nodded, his cheeks flushing, and walked back to his project. Moments like that reminded me why I'd started this journey in the first place. By the time I hit my mid-30s, my businesses were running smoothly. The youth center was thriving, and Claire and I had expanded our vision to other cities. We opened 3 more centers in neighboring areas, each tailored to the specific needs of the communities they served. But no matter how far we expanded, I always came back to that first center. It was a reminder of where I'd come from and why I'd worked so hard. One evening, as Claire and I sat on the balcony of our house, watching the sun set over the city, she turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "Do you ever think about that suitcase?" she asked. I smiled, shaking my head. "Not as much as I used to. It feels like a lifetime ago, like it wasn't even my life." She nodded, resting her head on my shoulder. "Whoever left it behind, I think they'd be proud of what you've done with it." I thought about the man who had unknowingly changed my life. I'd never know his story, his struggles, or his dreams, but I hoped that, in some way, I was honoring him by making the most of what he'd left behind. "I hope so," I said softly. "But what matters most is that I'm proud of it." And for the first time, I truly was.